Today's podcast is about places you can't go and people who went there anyway. This will be a top 3 style episode, so you'll hear 3 unique stories back to back to back, and each story will be more intense than the last one. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen, and they have each been remastered for today's podcast. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear, which is the number 3 story on today's list, is called A Harmless Stream, and it's about a group of young people who decided to make a late-night hike through a dangerous forest. The next story you'll hear, which is the number 2 story on today's list, is called Magellan, and it is about a particularly horrific thing that happened on an offshore oil rig. And the final story you'll hear, which is the top story of today's list, is called Boilermakers, and it's about a college freshman who finds an off-limits door on his campus. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the 5-star review button has an itch on their back, offer to scratch it for them, but continuously misunderstand their directions so you never actually itch the right spot. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called A Harmless Stream. In the late 1860s, a group of rugged American explorers came out of the wilderness and went straight to a newspaper to tell them about this otherworldly place they had found. And so the newspaper sat down, they got their notepad out, and these explorers start describing this place. And they say, okay, well, it's this huge expanse of wilderness. And in the middle of it, there are all these boiling lakes that are either neon green or yellow or red or all of those. And they're shooting boiling water into the sky. And there are these breathtaking waterfalls and snow-capped mountains. And there are bison and elk and wolves and bears just free roaming the whole area. And so the newspaper, they take all this down. And at the end of it, they say, okay, guys, well, unfortunately, we don't publish fiction. But these explorers weren't lying. They were describing an area that we now know as Yellowstone National Park, which is this massive expanse of wilderness in Wyoming that sits on top of a volcano. And those boiling neon green, red, and yellow lakes really do exist. Those are hot springs, and they are the result of water passing by and making contact with underground magma chambers. Today, Yellowstone is so popular that every year millions of people go to the park, and so as a result, the park employs hundreds of people year-round to keep up with tourism. Many of these employees are young people, like college students, and in addition to being paid for their work, the park also offers them the ability to live in employee housing, which are basically dormitories spaced all across the park to make it easier to just be on site and do their job. And these dormitories are either free or very low cost. And so these young people typically take up that offer and will stay inside of these dormitories for as long as they're working at the park. And so in 2000, a 20-year-old summer employee named Sarah Hulfers, she was staying in one of these dormitories in the park, and she was in her room when a group of other young employees that were staying in this dorm came down the hall and they knocked on her door and they asked her if she wanted to come with them to go swimming. And so Sarah, she had a day off and she wasn't doing anything. And so she said, sure, I'll come with you guys. And so after they all got their bathing suits on and got their towels and snacks packed, they left the dormitories and got into a couple of cars. And then they drove over to this dirt lot that was right up against this huge forest. And so they parked, they got out, and they make their way over to this trailhead that begins in the parking lot and goes straight into this forest. And so they walk down this trail until the trail goes right out of the forest and brings them to the edge of this river. And this river was called the Firehole River. It was called that because the surface of this river steamed, and it gave the impression that this river was on fire. The reason this happened is some of the water flowing through this river would pass by those underground magma chambers, warming it up. And so this is a lot like the hot springs, except on a much smaller level. The hot springs are boiling, whereas this river was just slightly warmer to the point where it would steam. So totally safe to swim in. So Sarah and the rest of this group, they come out of that trailhead and they're standing on the edge of this beautiful river, and they walk down to the edge and they all jump in and they have this great day. They're swimming around, they're playing games, and they were only expecting to be there for a couple of hours, but they were having so much fun that before long, the sun had gone down and they were still in the river. And so when it was dark out, they finally climbed out of the river and they toweled off, and then they realized they had a bit of a problem. Because they did not expect to be there for as long as they were, no one had brought flashlights. And the way back to the parking lot would be going along that trail through the forest, but that was a pretty far trail, and it's totally pitch black out. There's no ambient light, and realistically, there's some pretty big animals that live inside of that forest. And so some people in this group were a little bit nervous about walking through this forest. But ultimately, about half of the group said, you know what, whatever, let's just run through the forest and get back to our cars as fast as we can. I'm sure nothing will happen to us. And the other half decided they would look for an alternative route that would skirt the forest and allow the moonlight to be their guide along the way. That second group was made up of Sarah, along with two 18-year-old boys named Lance Bucci and Tyler Montague. So Sarah and these two boys, they're standing there and they're watching the first group go into the forest and disappear. And then she, along with these two guys, they turn right and they begin skirting the river and walking around the forest. And so they walk downstream with the river on one side and the forest on their left. And they're walking for a while until they see up ahead on their left, it looks like the forest is starting to thin out maybe a little bit. And so they took that as an opportunity to cut left and basically begin kind of going straight towards the parking lot, which was generally off to their left. And so they make that turn, they start walking, and the terrain is relatively open. It's this big open field with a couple of trees here and there. It was pretty easy to navigate, and they felt like, hey, we found a great alternative route. The moonlight's still shining through. We got great visibility. And so they're walking along happy as can be. And then they see there's a couple of streams up ahead. They get to the first stream and it's not that big, so they jump across it. They get to the next stream. It's still not that big. They jump across that one. And then they get to this third stream and they realize, it's still pretty small, but it's significantly bigger than the last two. And so if we mistime it, we could fall into it. Now, this was not some huge deal. They were already wet from having gone swimming, but they didn't want to jump in this stream. And so they considered walking off to the right and trying to find an area that was more narrow they could jump across more easily. But they figured they were probably within maybe 100 or 200 feet of the parking lot. They couldn't see it, but they knew they were close, and they really didn't want to go farther and farther away to only have to just jump over this thing anyways. And so they decide, you know what, let's just jump across it. Let's just do it. If we fall in, we fall in. And so the three of them backed up from the stream to give themselves some running room, and then they grabbed hands, and at the same time, all three of them ran forward and leapt across the stream. And they cleared it. They landed on the other side, but the ground they landed on was kind of loose and soft, and so it kind of crumbled underneath them, and they all fell backwards into the stream. In the darkness, this stream had looked like the other two streams they had seen, albeit a little bit larger, and so they were not thinking this could be potentially hazardous if they fell into the water. But it would turn out this stream was extremely hazardous. It was nothing like the other two streams they had encountered. This one was runoff from a nearby hot spring, and so the temperature inside of this stream was 178 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was practically boiling water, and it looked like it was shallow, but in fact, this stream was 10 feet deep. And so when this trio fell into these scalding waters, they let out blood-curdling screams, and the other group that had ran down the forest path, they had got to the parking lot and were waiting for them. And so they hear this scream and they just take off running in the direction of the screams. They cut right through the forest and they come out to that field and they find Lance and Tyler are on the edge of the stream, desperately trying to pull Sarah out of the water. And so the parking lot crew, they run over and they grab Sarah, they pull her out. They don't really know what's happened. They don't know this is some boiling stream, but it very quickly dawns on them when Lance and Tyler and Sarah just continue to scream outside of the water that something is horribly wrong. And so one of the people in the parking lot crew, they take off running, they go into one of their cars, and they drive and they get help. And not that long after, a helicopter would arrive and it would take Sarah, Lance, and Tyler to a nearby hospital. It would turn out Lance and Tyler, when they fell into this water, they only submerged up to their necks. And as soon as they hit the water, they immediately turned and got themselves out again. So they were only in the water for maybe a second or two. And these things ultimately saved their lives. Although they did still have burns over almost their entire bodies, they had to go through dozens and dozens of surgeries and years of rehab, and they had to pay all this money for medical bills. So it was not a smooth course after they got pulled out, but they lived. As for Sarah, she was not as lucky. When she fell into the water, she completely submerged. Her head, her body, all of it went under the water, and then she just could not get herself out again, and so she stayed in the water much longer than the guys did. When she was admitted to the hospital, despite the fact she was talking and conscious, the doctors very quickly realized they had a big problem with her. A third-degree burn, or a full-thickness burn, is when the outer layer of skin gets destroyed and also the inner, deeper tissues of the skin also gets destroyed, including the cells that are responsible for reproducing skin. And so if you get a third-degree burn, that part of your body will not heal on its own. You literally have to get a skin graft. And a skin graft is effectively a skin transplant. They will take other sections of skin from your body that are unburned, and they will place them over that site where you have the third-degree burn. But when Sarah was wheeled into the operating room, it was determined that she had third-degree burns on 100% of her body. So there was no unburned skin to use for a skin graft. Her whole body was ruined. And so despite their best efforts, Sarah would pass away 15 hours after arriving at the hospital. A year later, Lance's family would sue the National Park Service for not having put up a sign near that particular stream to warn people of its dangers. But that lawsuit was tossed out because it was determined that the trio, Sarah, Tyler, and Lance, had chosen to walk off trail in a known thermal area, and so they were being negligent, not the park. Next story, which is our number 2 story on today's list, is called Magellan. If you hop in a boat just off the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland, and you cruise eastward, after about 7 hours, depending on your speed and the weather, you would come across this massive man-made structure jutting up out of the ocean. It looks like a cross between a construction site and a corporate office building sitting on top of 100-foot-tall metal stilts. It's called Magellan, and it is an offshore oil rig, and it will remain in place until all the oil has been sucked up in that area. The people who work, often for weeks or months at a time, on rigs like Magellan are known as roughnecks, and they have one of, if not the most dangerous job in the world. All exterior surfaces on these offshore rigs are always slick, either with water or oil, and so there is a constant risk of falling, sometimes hundreds of feet. If you're up on a higher platform, you could fall to a lower platform, which could be fatal, or you could fall clean off the rig all the way to the ocean 100 plus feet below. If you add in some bad windy weather, the risk of falling increases tenfold. Also, the crude oil that these roughnecks are drilling for is highly combustible, and so fires are a huge concern as well. And if that wasn't risky enough, there's also this phenomenon known as a blowout, where basically the oil well that the drill is actually drilling into will just explode. Now, all rigs have some sort of mitigating equipment to try to save themselves in case this occurs, but in reality, if it happens and you are unfortunately near the drill when it happens, you are likely to be killed or maimed. While the downsides of working on an oil rig are fairly obvious, the upsides are too. Namely, your pay is fantastic. In 2000, a 41-year-old father of 2 named Gordon Moffat was a roughneck working on the Magellan. His primary job was to perform maintenance on the drill. Now, these offshore rigs work great most of the time, but they do have a habit of breaking down fairly often. And for a drilling company, any time they are not sucking out crude oil, they're losing money. And so it was just a known thing when you worked on one of these rigs that as soon as there is an issue that causes the drill to stop working, it must be fixed immediately, whether it's day, night, horrible weather, good weather, it didn't matter. It had to be fixed right away. And so on the night of October 9th that year, Gordon had just gotten back to his quarters to end the day when he got a call on his radio that he was actually needed to come back out to fix a problem that had stopped the drill. Now, Gordon was a seasoned roughneck, and he had grown quite accustomed to these late-night calls to go out and fix things, and so he wasn't annoyed. He just put his stuff back on, turned around, and he headed out the door. When Gordon got to the main deck, which is this wide open metal platform right in the middle of the rig where the drill actually passes down through it on its way to the ocean, when he got to the main deck, he was met by some of his coworkers who told him where he would need to go. The cabling that needed fixing was located right below the main deck. However, it was not accessible from the main deck. In order for Gordon to get to it, he would need to go down to the next lowest platform from the main deck. Basically, he would need to hop in an elevator and go down one floor. And from this lower deck, the crew on the main deck would lower down a harness attached to a long wire. They would feed it down through this hole in the main deck platform called a mouse hole. It was about 10 inches across. And they would feed it down, and he would grab the harness, he would put it on, and then he would signal up to the main deck crew, who could literally see him through this mouse hole. They would turn around and they would signal somebody called the hoist operator. And they were located above the main deck, slightly back. They couldn't actually see Gordon, so they're relying on communications with the people on the main deck. And the hoist operator would start their winch. And a winch basically reels in the wire that was connected to the harness that was on Gordon. And so once the hoist operator was informed, he'd turn on the winch, and then Gordon would be raised up until he could access these cables, and then he'd do his maintenance and be lowered back down, and that would be it. Now, Gordon and the crew had done maintenance using this winch system many times before, so this was a very routine fix. So Gordon made his way from the main deck down to the slightly lower deck, and he looked up at the mouse hole, and he watched as the main deck crew members lowered the harness with the wire attached to it down through the mouse hole. And so Gordon grabbed the harness, he put it around his waist, and he secured it. And after he was sure it was on correctly, he signaled up to the crew on the main deck that he was ready to start, and they in turn turned around. They flagged the hoist operator, who started the winch. And so very slowly, Gordon was lifted off the platform he was standing on, and he was brought up after several minutes, all the way up about 10 feet to access these cables. And as soon as he was parallel with them, he waved to the main deck crew, who were not far from him at this point, and he said, "I'm good." And so they turned around, they told the hoist operator, who stopped the winch. And so Gordon got his tools out and he began working on these cables, and the whole time he's trying to stay in one place because the wind is whipping through and he's kind of dangling and swinging around. And then eventually he finishes the repair. The cables are good. And so he signals the crew on the main deck through the mouse hole that he was good to go. You can lower me back down now. And so the main deck crew, they turn, they wave to the hoist operator to go ahead and lower Gordon. And the hoist operator, he gives the thumbs up and he starts the winch. However, the hoist operator accidentally forgot to switch the direction of the winch. And so when he started it again, instead of the winch spooling the wire out and lowering Gordon, it continued to reel the wire in, pulling Gordon upward. Now, the winch did not move very quickly, and so it wasn't like Gordon is rocketing up towards the mouse hole. However, this problem was immediately recognized by Gordon and the main deck crew, and so they're frustrated. They're yelling up at the hoist operator saying, "Stop, stop, stop, reverse the winch." They're all waving and flagging this guy down. But the hoist operator, after he had hit start on the winch, had just kind of turned around because this is a routine thing they've done a million times before. And so he's not looking at the crew on the main deck. So he has no idea what's going on. And it was so windy and loud that night on board the rig that he couldn't hear their cries. And so the winch just continued to reel in the wire, slowly raising Gordon closer and closer to the mouse hole. Now, Gordon could not get out of his harness unless he was on the platform below. So there was no way to escape the situation he was in. And so Gordon, after a few seconds of this not stopping and him continuing upward, he starts screaming. He's not annoyed anymore. He's terrified. And so is the crew on the main deck. They are now frantically screaming at the hoist operator to stop the winch, but nothing is working. And so one of the main deck crew members, sensing that they need to do something different to get this guy's attention, he runs away from where the mouse hole is to this nearby phone. And this phone is connected up to the hoist operator station, and he picks it up and it starts dialing. Up in the hoist operator station, he's still not paying attention when the phone rings. He grabs the phone, puts it to his ear, and immediately he's hit with screams to stop the winch. And so the hoist operator, totally confused, whips around and hits stop on the winch. But it was too late. Just a few moments earlier, Gordon had finally been pulled all the way up right to the entrance of the underside of this mouse hole. And as he reached this hole, he tried to position himself in a vertical position so that maybe he could slip his upper body into the hole and he could just kind of slide through the hole. He'd still be hurt by it, but it would limit the damage. However, because of his harness being on his waist right in front of him, he couldn't get himself into a vertical position. He could only lay back in a horizontal one. And so when he reached the underside of the main deck and he's looking right at this mouse hole, he just put his arms and his legs out and tried to push himself back as if he could fight the winch and keep himself from going into this hole. But there was nothing he could do. And so his pelvis first was pulled into the 10-inch hole. And as his body begins to literally break in half, he's screaming out in pain. And then by the time the hoist operator had hit stop, Gordon was already deceased, and only a section of his torso actually made it up through the hole. Gordon's company was found guilty of being blatantly delinquent on many safety protocols, and so they were fined 60,000 pounds, and then they paid an undisclosed amount to Gordon's family. The next and final story, which is the top story of today's list, is called Boilermakers. At 7:20 p.m. on Friday, January 12, 2007, 19-year-old college freshman Wade Steffi walked into Ford Dining Hall, which is one of 5 dining halls on Purdue University's campus. Purdue is a prestigious American university located in Indiana that is known for its excellent athletics and academics. Wade, who was an aviation technology student and was at Purdue on a full academic scholarship, grabbed some food and then sat down at a table with some friends. This was the first Friday of the 2007 spring semester, and so Wade and his friends at the table and the hundreds of other students that were sitting all around them were buzzing with excitement about what they were up to that night and what they were up to that weekend. And so Wade and his friends, they sat there chatting about their plans for about an hour. And then at around 8:20 p.m., Wade realized he needed to leave. And so he stood up, he said goodbye to his friends, he carried his tray to the trash can, and then he made his way out of the doors he came in on. And so once he was outside of the dining hall, he immediately turned right and walked the very short distance to the building that was right next to Ford Dining Hall. And so that building was called Owen Hall, and it was a dormitory. Now, this was not Wade's dormitory. He actually lived in a different dorm called Cari Quad West, which was located on the other side of Ford Dining Hall. And so Wade goes inside of Owen Hall because he has some friends in there, and he makes his way to their room, and when he goes inside, he sees they're all kind of sitting around chatting and drinking some alcoholic drinks. And so Wade sits down and he has a couple of drinks and he just hangs out with his friends for about an hour. And so around 9:30 p.m., Wade and the other people he was with in this room, they left Owen Hall and they walked the half mile away from campus to the west to this huge party at a fraternity. And so Wade would stay at this fraternity for several hours until about midnight, at which point he pulled one of his friends aside and he told them that he just remembered he had left his jacket inside of Owen Hall, and so he wanted to go back and retrieve it. The dorms on Purdue's campus all lock at night, and so the only way you can get inside is if you live there and so you have a key, or if you know someone who lives there who will open the door for you. And so during his walk back to Owen Hall, Wade would make 6 phone calls in an attempt to get someone in Owen Hall to open the door for him. But 4 of his phone calls would just be the wrong number. And so the people that were picking up and he was asking to open the door, they didn't know what he was talking about, and so they hung up. But he did call 2 people that did live inside of Owen Hall. However, they didn't answer their phones. And so around 12:30 a.m., Wade arrived at Owen Hall. He put his phone back in his pocket, and he just walked up to the doors, which were locked, and he just started knocking. And eventually, a resident of Owen Hall who didn't know Wade, and Wade didn't know them, they heard the knocking, and they came out to the door to see what was going on, and they looked through the glass, and they saw Wade, and apparently they decided that Wade looked too intoxicated to let into the building, and so they refused him entry. And so Wade apparently stood there. He kept knocking for a little bit, but he eventually just kind of gave up. He turned around and he walked away. Fast forward a few days to Tuesday, January 16th, and Wade's roommate, who had actually been gone all the past weekend, he returned, and the first thing he noticed when he got back to his dorm was that Wade was not in the dorm. And so he called and texted Wade, but he didn't get a response. And so the roommate went out around the floor that they lived on to ask people if they had seen Wade, and no one had seen him since the previous Friday. And so starting to get pretty concerned, the roommate called Wade's family to see if maybe they knew what was going on with him, but his family had no idea. And so by the end of that day, the police had been contacted about Wade potentially being missing, and they in turn contacted Wade's cell phone provider, and they were able to determine that Wade's cell phone was still showing up somewhere on Purdue's campus, although they couldn't figure out exactly where. So that evening, a massive campus-wide search was launched with hundreds of police officers and volunteers. Even the school's equestrian club came out with their horses to search the nearby woods. But despite this huge search effort that would go on for several weeks, the only thing they would find of Wade's was one of his shoes. It was found on January 20th, so just 4 days into the search, and it was located right outside of an exterior door that led into a maintenance room inside of Owen Hall. But when they searched this maintenance room, Wade wasn't in there. Finally, after nearly a month of searching, when they still had not found Wade, the official search was called off. On March 19th, roughly 2 months after Wade had been reported missing, a maintenance worker was downstairs in the laundry room of Owen Hall when they heard a strange popping sound. At first, the worker thought it was actually coming from one of the washers or dryers that was on, and maybe there's a loose coin or some piece of metal that was inside of the washer or dryer that's getting banged around inside, and that's making the sound. And so this worker began walking around the laundry room, kind of listening in to each of the washers and dryers that were on to see if they were making this sound. And so as he's doing this, he hears the popping sound again, but it's clearly not coming from any of the washers and dryers. In fact, it's not even coming from inside the laundry room. It's coming from somewhere out in the hall. Curious, he leaves the laundry room and he goes out into the hall, and as soon as he's standing in the hall, he hears the popping sound again. And this time, it was obvious that it was coming from behind the closed door that was directly opposite the laundry room. So the worker pulled out his big set of keys, he opened the door that was directly in front of him, and he stepped inside. Moments later, he would make a big discovery. Based on that discovery and the investigation that would follow it, this is a reconstruction of what happened to Wade Steffi. In the early morning hours of January 13th, right after Wade had been denied entry into Owen Hall because the student who was in there who didn't know him thought he was too intoxicated, right after that happened, Wade left the front doors and made his way around to the left side of the building to look for another way inside. And when he got to the left side of the building, he found another door. Now, even though this door did not have a sign on it that said "keep out," it was fairly obvious that this door was not designed for students to use. There was a metal railing that lined the outside of this door, clearly to prevent pedestrians from getting to the door, and the door itself was actually not built at ground level. It basically was built at basement level. So you'd be standing at this railing looking down at the door. And down in front of the door was a slab of cement right out in front of it that gave the door enough clearance to be able to open. And so basically there was a railing around a pit, and that was where the door was. The proper way to get to this door was to literally climb over that railing and jump down into this pit. And then you'd need a key to open this door because it was always locked. Well, it was supposed to always be locked. And so when Wade saw this clearly off-limits door on the side of Owen Hall, in his drunken state, he decided it would be a good idea to try to go into it, because in his mind, he thought, whatever is behind this door doesn't really matter. As long as I can just get inside of some part of Owen Hall, I can find my way up to my friend's room and I can get my jacket. And so he rushes over to the railing, he climbs over, he leaps down into that pit area, he grabs the doorknob of this off-limits door and he pulls on it, and it's open. And so he opens it up, he steps inside, and it's totally pitch black. And all he can hear is the sound of machines humming and whirring in the darkness. And again, in his drunken state, he decides this is still a good idea. His only concern was he couldn't find a light switch, and it really was basically pitch black in here. And he was worried once the door shut not only would his only light source be totally cut off, but it might actually lock behind him and then he'd be trapped inside of this room. And so he took off one of his shoes and he tucked it in the door jamb of the door he came in on to keep it open. And so with the door propped open behind him, he began walking into this room. And pretty much right away, he bumped into this big metal structure. He couldn't see what it was because, again, it was too dark, but he could feel it. And he could tell, it was a flat metal structure. It felt like a machine of some kind. And he could hear that it was one of the machines that was buzzing and whirring. And so he just decided he would try to walk around it. Because again, his goal is just to get through this room and find another door somewhere and kind of continue his journey up into the dorm. And so Wade began moving his way left along this machine, kind of believing it was going to come to a stop at some point, and then he could walk around it. But it would turn out this machine was very big, very wide. And so by the time he actually got to the left edge of this machine, he was practically right up against the wall of the room he was in. And when he got there, he realized the space between the side of the machine and the wall of the room was big enough that if he turned sideways, he could basically squeeze his way past it. Now, he had no idea how far into the room this strange machine went, but in his drunken state, he decided it was a good idea. And so he turned sideways, so his back is to the wall of the room, and his chest is going to be facing the machine, and he begins pushing himself into that narrow space. And so as he's making his way, his hands are up, kind of protecting his face and neck, and at some point, he kind of begins to trip. Now, he didn't actually fall because he's basically wedged into this tight space, but for a second, he reflexively grabbed with his hands onto this machine right in front of him, and just by chance, his left ring finger slipped into a very narrow hole that was about 2 inches deep. The room that Wade was inside of was called an electrical vault, and it contained 6 large transformers, one of which Wade's finger had just stuck inside of. The job of these 6 transformers is to take the high voltage they receive from the main power grid and then transform it, hence the name, into lower usable voltage that gets dispersed into Owen Hall for residents and teachers. Even though the outside of these transformers had mostly been covered with protective materials that mitigated the electrocution risk, there were still several parts of these machines that there was just nothing you could do. They just presented a really high electrocution risk. And one of those sections you needed to be extra careful with was that 2-inch hole that Wade's finger slipped inside of. At the back of that hole was an exposed electrical conductor, and the second the tip of his finger touched that conductor, between 2,000 and 4,000 volts of electricity were pumped into his body. For reference, when people get executed via the electric chair, they are electrocuted with 2,000 volts of electricity. Wade likely died instantly, but because of the fact that he was kind of wedged between the transformer and the wall, after he died, he didn't just slump onto the ground. Instead, he remained in a semi-upright position with his finger still stuck inside of that hole. And so for the next 2 months, his body just continued to be electrocuted every second. Finally, sometime in March, as a result of Wade's body fluids draining out of him, the electrical current that was being pumped into him altered its course and began snapping outside of his skin into the ground. And so the sound of the electrical current actually striking the ground was that popping sound that the maintenance worker heard. The door that the maintenance worker opened in order to investigate the sound was the only other door that led into the electrical vault, the other being the exterior door that Wade had gone in on. Initially, when the worker opened that door and looked inside of the vault, he actually didn't see Wade, but he smelled something funny, and that was what led him to walk into the room and make his way around, and that's when he spotted Wade's body. Earlier, on January 20th, when they found Wade's shoe, which at some point had just slipped out of the door jamb, so it was not propping open the exterior door when it was found, it was just sitting in that pit area, and the exterior door was shut. And so when they found that shoe, the police, they did go inside of the electrical vault, but they didn't go in through the exterior door. They went around and went in the same door that the maintenance worker opened from right across the hall from the laundry room. And when they opened it up, they just looked into the room. They didn't walk into the room. They just looked from the doorway. And from their perspective, they couldn't see Wade. And so that was why initially they had said, Wade is not inside of that room. Ultimately, because that exterior door to the electrical vault was supposed to be locked at all times, and clearly it was not because that's how Wade got in, Purdue was found to be negligent, and so they agreed to pay Wade's family $500,000, and they also set up a scholarship in Wade's name. Today's podcast features 3 unique stories about the dangers of the internet. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called First Date, and it's about a man who has a terrifying experience on Tinder. The second story you'll hear is called He Asked for Me by Name, and it's about a family who hears something strange coming from outside their window. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Influencer, and it's about a travel influencer who unknowingly falls into a trap. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the Amazon Music follow button to come over to your house for a sleepover, but give them a bed with no blankets or pillows. Okay, let's get into our first story called First Date. In 2018, a 21-year-old brand new police officer named Derek was dumped by his longtime girlfriend. This breakup caught him by surprise because he had actually just recently moved to Colorado in order to be closer to his girlfriend. So naturally, he was devastated. After a few weeks of being so depressed and kind of just moping around and going through the motions in his life at this point, one of his very close friends suggested to him, like, hey man, look, why don't you just make a profile on Tinder, the online dating service, and just put yourself out there again? You have no idea who's out there. Clearly, your ex-girlfriend was not the one. Derek had met his ex-girlfriend in a bar, and every other girlfriend he had ever had, he had met in person. So online dating was definitely not on his radar. But he was so lonely and sad, he figured, you know what? I got nothing to lose. And so he made himself a Tinder profile. Derek quickly matched with a woman on Tinder named Leah that he said was way out of his league, but he wasn't complaining. They chatted for a couple of weeks and they got on great, and so they wanted to get together and actually meet each other in person. But Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek, so there wasn't a natural meeting place, and they're going back and forth about where they want to go. And finally, Leah just says, hey, why don't you just come to my town? There's this great park that I go running in all the time, and they have this awesome field that's on a slope, and you can lay on it and look up through the trees and you can see the stars. And so that would be a cool thing to do on our first date, go stargazing together. So the date night finally came, and Derek was really excited. He was nervous too, because even though they talked on the phone, this is the first time they're going to see each other. And so the plan was he was going to drive out to her town and actually pick her up from her work. She worked at a hair salon, and from there they would make their way over to this park. And so Derek pulls up to the hair salon right as Leah is coming outside, and she's all excited and she's waving to him. She runs over and she gets in the car and they hug and kiss on the cheek. And it's like they knew each other, but they didn't know each other because their entire relationship was online or, via texting or a phone call. And so it's like they had history, but they didn't. But either way, Derek was really happy, and it seemed like Leah was too. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to this access road that was going to bring them into this park. And when Leah told him to make this turn, it didn't look like a very well marked trail or even a marked park. It looked like this kind of random access road that Derek would not have associated with a big public park. But he doesn't know the area, and so he turns and he starts heading down this road. And the road went from cement to dirt pretty quickly. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, did I take a wrong turn? Does she know where she's going? This does not feel like the way you drive into a big park, the way she was describing. Finally, they land back on cement, and they're actually on this road that's right up against this huge field. And so right away, Derek's stress is gone because now it's confirmed in his mind that, okay, that's a weird way to get into this park, but here's this huge, amazing field, and we're back on a real road, and everything's good again. Derek asked Leah, where should I park? Because they're on this really narrow road and there didn't appear to be a parking lot. There also didn't appear to be anybody else on this field or on this road. It's this huge, open, beautiful space, but it did not look well populated or like it was well traveled. But she said, just go right up there. There's a small lot you can pull into. And so Derek starts going up this road and he sees maybe 300 feet ahead of him are dim headlights of another car making their way down the road towards him. And now it was dark enough that he couldn't really make out what kind of vehicle it was. And so he didn't know if it was going to be some big truck or something like that. And so what he did is he just pulled over as far to the side of the road as he could to allow this vehicle to pass, even though there was a fair amount of distance they would need to cover before they were passing him. He figured just give them the right of the road. And so as they start moving forward, you can see that it's actually this big van and they're moving pretty slowly and he's just kind of waiting for them to pass and he's not thinking anything of this. He's thinking that this is just another person at the park. And this van, instead of passing him, actually turns at the last second and almost goes bumper to bumper with Derek's car. He doesn't crash into it, but he stops just in front of Derek's car. And so Derek is a cop. He's a brand new cop. And he's super aggressive. He really believes in his training. And so as soon as this guy stopped in front of him and blocked the path for him, red flags are going up for Derek and he knows something's wrong with this van. And instinctively, he says, Leah, stay here. He grabs his flashlight that he kept right in the center console and he jumped out of the car and went right to the driver's side door of this van to confront this guy. And when he got up to the driver's side door, it was this really big guy who looked pretty startled to see Derek come charging up to him with his flashlight. And Derek's like, what are you doing, man? What are you blocking me in for? And the guy's like, oh, hey, sorry, I'm the caretaker here of this whole property. And we've had an issue with poachers in the area. And I was concerned you guys were poachers. It doesn't look like you're poachers, though. And Derek's like, no, we're not poachers. We're going stargazing. I'm on my first date here. And the caretaker's like, I am so sorry. Please get back in your car, go and enjoy your night. And at that, he backed up, did a 3-point turn and drove right back up that road where he came from and disappeared down on the other side of the hill. Derek stood in front of his car for a couple of minutes, making sure this guy was gone. And then he turned around and he got back in the car and he kind of joked with Leah. And he's like, yeah, he thought we were poachers. I guess you look like a poacher to him. And that's why he stopped us. But when he looked over at Leah to react to his hilarious joke, she wasn't paying attention to him. She was just furiously typing away on her phone, which Derek did think was a little bit odd. You'd think that she'd be more interested in this strange thing that just happened. Some weird guy just blocked us in and I'm confronting him. You'd think she'd be interested in that on some level. She might want to know what I said to the guy and what he said to me, but she didn't seem to care. She was just really invested in whoever she was typing on her phone. And so Derek thinks whatever and just throws the car back in drive and continues up the trail the way they were going before they were stopped. So Derek continues down the road just a little ways until he sees a little dirt lot that's butted up against this huge field they're going to be hanging out on for the night. And so he pulls into the lot, backs into a space, and he and Leah get out and they put a blanket out right next to the car, but on the grass on the hill. And they get their food out and their wine out and they sit down and very quickly they start swapping stories and they're laughing and they're stargazing and they're having some wine and everything's really great. After about an hour, it's totally dark outside, and Derek is laying on the hill facing back towards his car and towards the road they were on. And he notices to his left, up at the top of the hill, so the same area where the van had come from originally and where it went back to after they spoke that one time. Derek is looking out there and he sees headlights, and it's the van. And now the van is driving down the road, not leisurely like it was before, but they are flying down the hill. And before Derek or Leah have a chance to react to this van barreling down on them, it comes flying into the parking lot and practically hits his car and comes to a stop where it's boxed his car in. So even if he got in his car, he couldn't drive away. And so Derek jumps up, Leah jumps up, and the guy, the caretaker, the nice caretaker he talked to before, he hops out of the driver's seat and he walks around the front of the van. He's got this pipe in his hand and he looks at Derek and he's like, give me your keys and your wallet. And again, Derek is this brand new cop. He's 21 years old. He's not about to let this guy push him around. And so he doesn't do anything at first. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he doesn't do anything at first. He just looks at this guy and he shows him that I'm not just going to fall over because he told me to. But then Derek is given a huge curveball when Leah, his date, stands up and runs over to this guy and stands next to him and turns around and looks at Derek and goes, come on, give us your keys and wallet. And Derek's like, great, I'm getting set up by my date, who I've spent the past 2 hours with, who I was at a connection with this girl. And so now Derek is just standing there doing nothing, not to be tough, but because he's in shock. He feels so betrayed by Leah, and he just feels like, how could this have happened? And in that moment, Leah walks to the back of the van, and she gets a metal pipe. She comes back around, and she goes, Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We don't want to have to hurt you. And this is when Derek looks at them both, and he goes, no. And as soon as he said that, the big guy tackles him. He gets thrown to the ground, but Derek could handle himself, and very quickly he was able to get up, and he drew his concealed carry pistol, and he's aiming it at the big guy and then back at Leah, and he's like, yeah, I'm a cop. Go ahead and put your hands up now. As soon as they saw the gun, they both dropped their pipes and put their hands up. And so as he's holding them both at gunpoint, and he's looking over at Leah like, really? You did this to me? Are you kidding me right now? As he's doing that, he has to get his cell phone out of his pocket, type in 911, and then call dispatch and had to say who he was, what his badge number was, what happened, and where he is. And where he is was difficult to describe. And so as he's trying to explain these directions, and he's saying, yep, go left at the light, and then there's a gas station there. You're gonna go up this field, you're gonna see me, I got these two people at gunpoint. As he's doing that, Leah and the caretaker look at each other, and they just turn around and bolt. They figure, he's distracted, we can at least get behind the van and run into the forest before he's going to catch us. And so instinctively, he takes off running after them, and he chases them for about 30 seconds into the tree line before he starts hearing gunshots. And they weren't his, someone's shooting at him, and he sees the muzzle flash out in the middle of the forest, and he's like, yeah, I'm not doing this. He turns around, runs back to his vehicle, he starts it up, and he has to basically smash into the van, back into the fence over and over again, like Austin Powers, like a 25-point turn, before he was barely able to grind his way out and peel out of this park. And so Derek pulls into the nearest gas station. He calls up dispatch and he says, hey, I just called 911 like 5-10 minutes ago and I dropped the call because I was chasing somebody. Here's my name. Here's my badge number. I'm now at this gas station. Can you send a couple of police officers over to my location now? And they said, yep, we'll send some to you. And so a police cruiser shows up with 2 officers inside that Derek recognized. They were senior to him, and they got out, and he explained again what happened, and they kind of gave him a hard time for getting catfished on his very first date, but at the same time, they knew it could have gone really badly, and so they decide they're going to load up in the police cruiser together, all 3 of them, and drive back up to the park. And so they get up to the park, and Derek points ahead, and he goes, that's the van, it's still here. And so they drive up, and they stop short of the van, and the 2 uniformed officers, they turn to Derek, and they're like, just stay in here, we're going to go check this van out. And so Derek's sitting in the car watching these guys go up to the vehicle, guns drawn. They're looking all around. They're clearing behind the vehicle. They're looking in the wood line. There's nobody there. And at some point he sees them put their pistols away and they go in the van. They're kind of shining with their flashlights all around. They're looking in the back, looking in the front. And then after a few minutes, they walk back to the cruiser. And as soon as they got in, Derek could tell there was just something off about how they were acting. When they were down at the gas station, they were kind of joking around with him. Now, whatever they had seen in the van was definitely not something they were going to joke about. And they turned to him and they're like, the back of the van, it was just knives and saws and pistols and rifles and lighter fluid and chains and handcuffs and duct tape. It was just awful. And it looks like there might even be blood on the ground. The 2 officers immediately called in additional backup, and before long, it was a full-fledged circus around this van of a crime scene investigation unit and other police officers, spotlights set up, and they went out looking in the woods for these people, but they never found the guy, they never found the girl, and Derek would tell the other investigators, hey, she works at this hair salon, like right down the road, I picked her up there. And so they went over to the hair salon, and they wound up talking to the people there, and they said, we've never heard of Leah. And when they showed them a picture of Leah, they were like, we've never seen her before. And so they came back and they told Derek, look, she's a con artist. And this whole thing, your whole relationship with her has been her setting you up in some way, shape, or form. The entire thing. That's all it ever was. And so for Derek, that was crushing. And he swore off Tinder immediately. He did not want to do any more online dating. But what really haunts him more than just being taken advantage of is what would have happened if I wasn't concealed carrying? Would I have wound up in the back of that van? Our next story is called He Asked for Me by Name. In the summer of 2019, a grandmother named Barbara was looking after her grandkids for the weekend while her daughter and her husband were out of town. Her daughter had 3 kids, 2 that were under the age of 6 and 1 who was 15 years old, and her name was Alyssa. And so anytime Barbara was looking after her grandkids for longer than just a single day, like if she was taking care of them overnight, she would just stay at their house so as not to disrupt their lives more than she needed to. And so their house was a modest single-story home in a nice suburb of Dallas, Texas, where the crime rate is basically 0 and everybody in the neighborhood knows each other. And so this particular night that she's over there looking after them was like any other. She put the 2 young ones to bed first, and then she and Alyssa stayed up a little bit later in the kitchen chatting, talking about school, before ultimately both of them went to bed. So because their house is a single-story home, all the bedrooms are on the only floor of the house. And so Barbara and Alyssa's room were right next to each other, looking out to the side of the property. And so as soon as Barbara got in her room, she opened up the window that was right next to her bed, because as a kid, she always slept with the window open. And even though her daughter's house had air conditioning, she preferred to keep the window open. So window's open, she has a screen that's in her window, and Barbara crawls into bed and she falls asleep. At about 3 a.m., Barbara wakes up to the sound of rustling coming from outside of her window. And so she hears it, but it sounds an awful lot like it's probably just a dog or a cat or some other animal that's in the area. It did not seem like a big deal to her, and she was just going to forget about it. But then she heard it again, and it sounded much more like footsteps, and they sounded heavy enough that it probably couldn't be a dog or a cat. And so she rolled over onto her elbows and she pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out the screen door. And so the moon was out, so there was pretty good illumination, and so she could clearly see the side of the house. She could see the side of the house, she could see the fence that separated their property and their neighbors, and then she could see the neighbor's house and all their lights are off. And she noticed propped up against the fence on their side of the fence, so on their property, was this bike that she didn't recognize. And she's looking at it thinking, is that Alyssa's bike? It's too big to be either of the 6-year-old's bikes. Whose bike is that? And as she's looking at the bike, she hears more rustling coming from the left, which is closer to Alyssa's room. Barbara presses her face up against the screen to try to look out the window towards the left because whatever's making the sound is now out of her view. And as she's got her face pressed up against the screen trying to look, she sees a boy emerge from the bushes from right underneath Alyssa's room. He's got that high school Letterman jacket, like the classic, football jacket that high school kids wear. He comes out of the bushes wearing that, and he's got his hood pulled up, and he doesn't look over at her. He's just backing up away from Alyssa's room, and he's looking up into Alyssa's room. And so Barbara immediately thinks, okay, this guy is probably one of Alyssa's friends, maybe a boyfriend, I don't know. And Alyssa must have invited him over. Maybe she invited him when she knew her parents were going to be out of town, but before I said I was going to be here to look after them, and that message didn't get passed to him, and so he's here. All these scenarios are going through Barbara's head, but all she knew is she's not going to call the cops on some teenage kid that's coming to say hi to Alyssa. Instead, she's going to confront him. Because Barbara was actually a high school teacher and had been for decades. And so she'd had lots of run-ins with badly behaved teenagers, and she was pretty good at standing her ground and being firm and kind of getting teenagers to listen to her. So she figured she would just go out there and be stern with him and he'd get the message. And so she quietly gets off of her bed. She walks out of her room to the front of the house. So he's over here, side of the house. She's going to the front of the house. She flips on the lights as soon as she's outside, and she quickly walks around to the edge of the porch where she can poke her head over and see right down the side of the house where this kid's going to be. So she pokes her head over and she goes, "Can I help you?" And this kid turns and looks at her for the first time. And immediately Barbara's like, oh, whoa, he is not a teenager. He looks like he's in his 20s, if not 30s. No matter what, he is a lot older than Alyssa. And it caught her so off guard, she didn't really know how to react to it. She was just looking at this guy who looks so much older, but he's got a bike and he's wearing a Letterman jacket. And so Barbara's a little bit confused. And so she's thinking to herself, okay, it's possible that he could just be one of those kids that looks a lot older than he really is. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she's thinking, this doesn't feel right. This feels like a grown man is trying to get into the house. And so as she's thinking about this, she's also registering that this guy, he seems completely unfazed. He's just looking up at her, and he actually starts taking steps towards her to the point where Barbara says, stop where you are. And he does. And he looks up at her and he says, I'm looking for Alyssa. Is she home? And so as Barbara is just glaring at this guy, hoping that will be enough to get him to leave, but he's not leaving, it occurs to her that this could be a misunderstanding. And so thinking on her feet, she says to him, who did you say you're looking for? Lisa? Without any hesitation, he goes, no, I'm looking for Alyssa McCarran. She lives here. Barbara went silent for a second because he was right. That was her name, and she certainly was here. But she did not want him coming anywhere near the house until she had a chance to talk to Alyssa and confirm that she had invited him here, or at the very minimum, that she knew who he was. And so Barbara says to the guy, I need you to stay right there. It's 3 a.m. I don't know you. Give me a minute. I'll be right back. And he appears to get the message. And so Barbara went back inside the house. She shut and locked the door behind her. And then she went into Alyssa's room and she shook her foot to wake her up. And so Alyssa kind of sits up and she's looking around and she's like, what's going on? And Barbara looks at her and she's kind of annoyed with how the night's gone. And at this point, she's kind of blaming Alyssa for probably having invited this strange creep over to their house in the middle of the night. And she says to Alyssa, did you invite a boy here tonight? And Alyssa's like, no, what are you talking about? Barbara narrowed her eyes and she said, well, there's a boy outside that clearly knows you. He asked for you by name and he knows you live here and he's outside right now. Can you please go out there and tell him that coming over unannounced at 3 a.m. is not very polite and he shouldn't do it again? Alyssa's confused and she's looking at her grandmother like, what are you talking about? And so she leans back and she opens the curtain of her window and she looks outside and immediately she pulls her head back in and she says, Grandma, he asked for me by name? And Barbara's like, yeah, he said Alyssa McCarran lives here. And Alyssa's like, we have to call 911. I've never seen him before in my life. Suddenly, everything made sense for Barbara. This was a stranger. This is not a friend. This is probably a grown man, and he was probably trying to break into Alyssa's room. And so as she's having this realization, they both hear footsteps out on the front porch. And at this, Barbara goes into full protective grandmother mode, and she tells Alyssa, stay in your bed, do not move. And Barbara runs out of her room. She goes into her bedroom, and she shuts that window and locks it, and then runs to the front of the house to make sure that door was locked, because she thought she locked it when she came in, but she wasn't 100% sure. She gets right in front of it, and she can see that it's locked. And now she's standing right on the other side of the door, kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. And this guy is standing on the porch, but obscured. She can't see him because he's on the other side of the door. And it's silent for a second. And as she's standing there just waiting for something to happen, she hears knocking on the door. And it startled her when she heard it, and she yelled out, there's no Alyssa McCarran here. You have the wrong house. You need to leave or I'm calling the police. And the knocking stops for a second, and he says, I know Alyssa lives here. Tell her to come outside. He goes back to knocking, and Barbara picks up her phone and she calls 911, and she intentionally talks really loudly into the phone, making it very obvious she is calling the police. And very clearly, this guy picked up on what Barbara was doing because the knocking stopped and she saw him through the little slit of glass next to the door run to the left of the house back towards the side where his bike was. And so Barbara, while on the phone, runs into the bedroom where she was sleeping and she looks out the side window. And the last she sees of this guy is riding his bike across the street. And then he stops next to an SUV and he opens a trunk and he throws the bike in the trunk and he gets in the passenger side of the car and they drive off. Which means whatever he had planned to do with Alyssa or whatever he was doing this night, he had an accomplice. The police show up a couple minutes later, and at this point, this creep and whoever he was with are long gone, but Barbara still gives her description of the vehicle and description of the night and what happened, and the police told her that over the past couple of weeks, they've gotten very similar reports from other households where there are young girls inside of the house. Apparently, this boy was actually a grown man that would use social media to figure out where kids lived, and then he would dress up like a teenager, and then he would go stalk them. And so whatever Alyssa had listed online, he had been able to deduce that she lived there, and who knows how long he had been looking in the window at her at night. The next and final story of today's episode is called Influencer. In 2018, an up-and-coming Instagram influencer named Wendy was contacted by a hotel in Miami, Florida that wanted to see if she'd be willing to stay at their property over Memorial Day weekend. They said they were willing to cover all of her expenses as long as she was willing to post a couple of times while she was at the hotel showing off how great the hotel was. They also told her to bring along a female friend and that friend they would cover all of her expenses as well. Even though Wendy didn't know if she had any girl friends that would want to do this with her, she was so eager to take them up on this opportunity because she was trying to make being an influencer be her full-time job. And so opportunities like this were huge for her. And so she said yes, even before she knew if she could bring along a friend like they asked her to. And so sure enough, over the next couple of days, as she reached out to her network to see if there's any females that wanted to come with her, everybody was either busy or wasn't that interested or they had plans. And so since she did not want to cancel, she thought, well, it can't be that big of a deal if I bring along a male friend. And so she reached out to her good friend Mitch, who's this 6'4" athletic guy who was just one of her close friends. And she said, hey, would you mind coming along with me to this thing in Miami over Memorial Day weekend? I need someone to go with me. They asked for a female, but you're going to have to do. And so Mitch agreed to do it. And Wendy thought to herself, well, worst case scenario is they're not willing to pay for Mitch's, expenses and that she would pay for them. And she told Mitch as much. And so they thought that was just fine. They figured that was a good solution. And so the day arrives and Wendy and Mitch are really excited about this trip. They don't often get to go travel around as influencers. And so they hop on a plane, they fly first class to Miami. When they get there, they go down, they get their bags at a baggage claim, and then they go out to the curb. And right away, Wendy sees there's this really well-dressed guy with dark sunglasses on, and he's holding up a sign that has her last name on it and the logo of the hotel on it. And so she waves to him and walks over, and Mitch is following right behind. And this guy looks at her and he says, okay, well, where's your friend? And that's when she says, oh, well, actually, I brought Mitch because none of my girlfriends wanted to go. So I brought Mitch along. And so this guy lowers his sunglasses and he looks at Mitch and he kind of looks up and down. Then he puts his sunglasses back and he turns and he walks towards this beautiful black SUV that's parked right up against the curb. And so Wendy and Mitch follow him, and this guy opens up the back door, and Wendy and Mitch get in. The guy takes their luggage and puts it in the back of the vehicle and shuts it. And as soon as Wendy and Mitch sit inside of this car, the driver is visibly upset. He's kind of ranting and raving, and the front passenger window was down. And so Wendy and Mitch assumed he must be yelling at someone outside of the vehicle, like this guy that had just picked them up. He must be communicating with him somehow. He can't possibly be yelling at us. We just got here. We don't know him. But sure enough, as they kind of are tuning into what he's saying, he has a very thick accent and he's saying, "Where is the other girl? You're not supposed to have a guy. It's two girls, not one girl, one guy. It's two girls. Where is the other girl?" As Wendy is hearing this, she feels so uncomfortable, not just for herself, but for Mitch too, because she asked him to come along and had said, "Oh, it won't be a big deal. They won't mind." But I mean, clearly they do mind. And so Wendy's trying to explain to the driver that, "I know you asked for a female friend, but I didn't have a female friend. And so I brought him along. I will pay for him. I'm not asking you guys to pay for him. I'll pay for everything that he touches. I'll pay for his hotel, his flight, everything." But the driver didn't seem that upset about who was paying for Mitch. His frustration came from a place of being frustrated, like they weren't going to be able to do whatever they had planned to do because now Mitch is in the mix. And so as Wendy and the driver are kind of going back and forth and the driver's getting more and more frustrated, the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch hopped in the front seat and he and the driver started arguing with each other in Portuguese. And so for about a minute, Wendy and Mitch are looking at each other like, what is going on here? And these guys are yelling at each other and then they stop and the driver turns around again. And one more time he says to Wendy, "Where is the other girl?" And Wendy says, "There is no other girl. It is Mitch and I. That is it." At this point, the driver makes a sound like he was disgusted with both of them, and he raises his hand up like this, and he turns to face the road in front of him, and the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch, he gets out of the passenger seat, goes around to the back, opens the back of the truck, takes their luggage out, throws it onto the curb, goes to the door that is closest to Mitch, opens it up, and he tells them to get out. And so Wendy and Mitch climb back out onto the curb, the guy shuts the door behind them, he hops back in the front seat, and that car peels away. That was it. At this point, Wendy's thinking to herself, I bet those two guys have nothing to do with the hotel and the people that I had been communicating with to set this whole thing up. I bet they are just the drivers and they were told to pick up two girls and we showed up with a girl and a guy and it screwed them up and they got mad and they got really mad, I guess, and then they left. And so I bet if I can just get in touch with the people at the hotel, the people I had spoken to, that they can clear this whole thing up. And so she opens up her email and she sends a message to Marissa, who was one of the people at the hotel that she had been going back and forth with when she was buying her plane ticket. And then she sent another message to the Instagram account that had over 10,000 followers that she had been going back and forth with quite a bit that had actually originally reached out to her. And so for a couple of minutes, Wendy is watching her phone, waiting for a response. And at some point, Mitch says to her, by the time we get a response to either your, Instagram DM or your email, we probably could have just taken an Uber over to the hotel and spoken to them directly. So why don't we just go do that? And so they agree, they hop in an Uber and they drive the short distance to this hotel. And as soon as they get out, Wendy notices something that at the time did not seem like a big deal, which was the logo of the hotel, the one in real life right in front of her. It was a little bit different than the one that is on the Instagram page, the one she had been talking back and forth with. That was their profile picture. It's different than the one in real life. And so that stood out to her just because she had looked at that page a number of times. But it was definitely the same hotel, and so she didn't think much of it. And she and Mitch walked inside right up to the front desk, and Wendy asked to speak with a manager. And shortly thereafter, a manager comes out, and she asks Wendy and Mitch to come into her office. They go inside, and she says, "Okay, guys, what's going on? What do you need?" And so Wendy explains the framework of the deal she had negotiated with Marissa. And she said, look, when I got to the airport, the guys that picked us up were incredibly rude and they wouldn't give us a ride here. And I just want to let you know what happened. We don't care. We got a ride here, but we just figured you should know. And the woman looks at her kind of puzzled and she says, "Who was the person you talked to? You said Marissa?" And Wendy's like, "Yeah, Marissa. She's the marketing person here." And the manager looks at her and she says, "No, I'm the marketing person and my name's Kelly. I think you're at the wrong hotel because we don't have any influencers that are here right now. And I would have known about this." Wendy can't believe it, and she pulls up the Instagram page she's been talking to, and she shows it to the manager. And the manager takes it, and she's pretty surprised by what she's looking at. And she's like, this is our old account. We deleted this, or I thought we deleted this. We have a new one because we rebranded. We have a brand new logo. Everything's new, and we just felt like we'd start fresh. So I don't know who owns this account now, but that is our account. It's just, we don't use it anymore. I don't know how anyone got a hold of it. At this point, it clicked for Wendy that this whole thing was a facade, that this whole time she was being conned, and what really scared her is, to what end? What were they trying to do with her? Had she shown up with the other female friend, what would they have done with her? But at this moment, Wendy just feels totally overwhelmed by the entire moment. She's so embarrassed that she thought this was real, and she dragged Mitch along, and this whole thing was just fake. She's so embarrassed that she just approached this manager who basically said, that's all fake. And so she just wanted to leave. And so she stands up and she says, I'm really sorry for wasting your time to the manager. And she and Mitch leave. She goes outside and she just sits down and she's crying. And Mitch says, hey, you really ought to call the police and let them know this happened because, clearly there were plans for you and, had you brought a female friend, and they can't have been good plans. I think you need to let the police know that this scam exists. And so Wendy does call the police and she explains what happened. And she's surprised when they say, hey, where are you right now? We'd love to send a detective over to you to talk to you a little bit more about what happened. And so Wendy tells them where they are. And, she's a little bit surprised that they want to send a detective over to talk about this because in her mind, this isn't that big of a deal. I mean, it's a big deal to her and to Mitch, but nothing really happened. But either way, they go sit on the bench right outside the hotel and they wait for the detective to show up. And just a couple of minutes later, he does. He walks up, he introduces himself, and he says, hey, let's go inside and grab a table and we can chat. And so they go inside and they sit down, and Wendy and Mitch go over their story one more time. And after they're done, the detective says, look, I don't mean to scare you, but I do want you to understand just how serious of a situation you guys were just in. So in Miami, human traffickers use these phony hotel Instagram accounts to attract young women like yourself to Miami in order to be trafficked. And so they will buy these old business Instagram accounts from companies that have either rebranded or who are going out of business. They'll pay top dollar to acquire those Instagram accounts. And then they will use them in order to get people like you to come to Miami. And so probably the only reason they didn't follow through on their operation is because you brought Mitch along who posed a threat to them. And so that's why they were upset with you. And that's why they decided it wasn't worth it. So even though this must have been incredibly traumatic for you, I'm sure you were spared a much worse fate.